Hi everyone. I'd just like to give you a quick introduction to this week's module, African Philosophy and Method, Sage Philosophy and Beyond. And, in this module I'm trying to accomplish a couple of different things. Number one, I'm trying to get you to think about sage philosophy, and to that end I have an interview with Gail Presby, who is really one of the pioneers in the field. The other thing I'm trying to do is, as the title suggests, get you to think about method in philosophy in general. And that's something that, you may not have thought that much about, even in any other philosophy course. If you think about method, you might find yourself just thinking that, well, philosophy's method is maybe something like logic or reasoning in general, or maybe self-reflection, or we might come up with a number of different possibilities for what we think method actually is. But I want to think about it, and I've kind of given you a little introduction to it here, and then I want to focus on a specific kind of area of thought within African philosophy, and that is Yoruba thought. Okay, so I've got some videos in the module where you can kind of get a background of Yoruba thought. One of the reasons I chose it is because it's important not only within Africa but also within the African diaspora. And so, Yoruba thought, we might think of it as Ifa, and within Ifa there are the Orishas, who are, we might think of them as spirits or something like gods, although not exactly. And what you find is that elements of this find their way into Cuban religion, into Brazilian, into other Caribbean forms of faith, and we also find it becoming syncretistic with especially Catholic saints. So the Catholic saints and some of the Orisha kind of freely, swap characteristics and so forth. And so it's an interesting place for a philosopher to think about things, because for many people, if they're going to think about African philosophy, they're going to think about something like Yoruba thought. They're going to think about Ifa or the Orisha thought. That's what comes to mind when many people think of African thought, and that is a kind of cosmological system, a kind of, what really exists in the world. And, when it comes to, African thought, for many people, there is a certain sense that there's a spirituality that is, assertions of metaphysical beings beyond the physical realm. And that might involve ancestors, that might involve spirits of various sorts. One might want to talk about witchcraft, ancestor worship, the ways that those spirits are integrally related to natural processes, so spirits of particular kinds of things. So, that's why we sometimes call this animist, some versions of African faith as animist religion. And so, there are a lot of different ways that somebody could see philosophy as engaging with that, those assumptions about the world. And the way we often think about philosophers engaging with that sort of thing is, I guess, to, first off decide what's true and what isn't true. In other words, to ask the question, do these spirits really exist, or don't they? How would we tell? And that really in some ways is a problematic place to start, for any kind of metaphysical or cosmological system that is, other than a kind of basic materialist or basic empiricist sort of approach. And certainly it's problematic when it comes to African philosophy. It's something that's been brought into Africa quite a lot, that kind of challenge. Show me these spirits, show me these gods, show me these ancestors, where are they? And it really in some ways misses a lot of what would go into African philosophy, how thought works, how memory works, how value works, what we value, how we communicate that value, all sorts of things of that nature. But the reason I wanted to use Yoruba thought is not just that it's widespread, it's well known, there's a lot written on it, but also that there are all sorts of different, I guess you could say, approaches for philosophers to engage with Yoruba thought. And so I've listed a bunch of those within within the module. You can see them here in the module under what I'm calling examples in African philosophy. Now I've listed 11. I could probably extend that list, but beside each of those, I've listed a reading, and I'm not expecting you to do all these readings. So this is not why I'm listing these here. Okay, so don't think that I'm have just given you 11 things to read plus some videos and an interview to watch. I know that's a lot of work for a module. My point here is not that you read each of these. I have made all of them available, by the way. If you go to the module itself, you will see links to all of these readings that are in forms of paper. Some of them are in our textbook, and so for those I've listed the textbook numbers. So the Shagan Badagason one is in our textbook, and you can see here that I've listed the page numbers. Same with the Oladipo one and Oyewumi's one on visualizing the body as well. So those three are in our text. The rest of them I have listed in the module, and they I've just kind of given them here so that you can have a sense of the various ways that somebody could approach this way of thinking about the structure of the world. So I've started with one that I'm calling interview or dialogue. The Philae piece here, philosophic sagacity and the problems of transmitting philosophical knowledge without writing, the Akiti Yoruba experience. And so we're going to talk about sage philosophy mostly in a Kenyan context, but here's an example of it being thought about in a Yoruba, in a Nigerian context as well. And so that's what I'm going to call a method of thinking, of doing philosophy. Okay. The second example I've given is language analysis, and there's this fairly famous philosopher in African philosophy named Barry Hallen. Hallen worked for decades really in Nigeria, and he wrote a number of books while there, collaborating with local philosophers. And his approach was to look at the language itself as the entry point to philosophy. If only we can take apart the language, see what it really means, do what's called ordinary language analysis on it, we can start to see the structures of epistemology. Like how do we constitute knowledge? Like how do we say that we know something versus believing something or just thinking something? And so he did quite a lot of work on that kind of language analysis. There's what I'm calling analytic philosophy here, which is a term that we use within Western philosophy, but this is on literally a problem in epistemology within Western philosophy, on the Gettier problem in Yoruba epistemology. So this is an example of thinking about Yoruba thought in the context of this problem in epistemology, essentially. This problem on, if you've taken any epistemology at all, you'll know that there's a kind of classic definition of knowledge, propositional knowledge, which is that it's true, justified belief. And so this fellow Gettier came up with a bunch of problems with that definition. So there's that, kind of thinking about Yoruba thought using the tools of analytic philosophy. There's a book which I'm giving, have a chapter here by Helen Varon. The book is called Science in an African Logic, and this is a chapter called Two Consistent Logics of Numbering. And this is an approach to Yoruba philosophy, which I'm calling a approach based in logic. What would it look like to think about logic as the kind of fundamental or formative, feature of Yoruba thought? So after that, I've got the what I'm calling conceptual analysis. You can see here that's the Badagason and the Oladipo articles, and so they're very clearly on kind of the analysis of specific concepts, the concept of the person, and metaphysical concepts within Yoruba thought. There's historical analysis, which is this article here, the problem of gerontocracy in Africa. What's gerontocracy? Well, the idea that we ought to be ruled or led by the elderly, the old people, essentially. And so this is the Yoruba perspective as illustrated in the Ifa corpus. So this person is going into Ifa, what I just mentioned, the kind of religious, mythical, philosophical version of Yoruba thought, to look at the question of should we really be led by those who are the oldest ones among us. From there, I go to Sophie Olawole. Olawole is, an important Nigerian philosopher, and she writes, a book, but this is a chapter from that book on, some existing canons of distinguishing between Western and African philosophy. And so she runs through this to try and think through, what are the methods that we can use in order to understand African philosophy, and can we simply apply Western methods to do that? And her answer really is no. If we do that, that's a distorting thing. This actually comes in the context of this book that she wrote called Socrates and Orunmila. So Orunmila is one of the Orishas within Yoruba thought, who is usually thought of as the Orisha of wisdom. And so as the Orisha of wisdom, the kind of personification, if you wish, of wisdom, she has made the argument that this person really existed. It's not just a mythological figure or a god or something like that. And she makes the argument that this person really functions very much the way Socrates functioned. Socrates never wrote anything down. It was written by Plato some 30 years after Socrates. Socrates just went around and challenged people on things, produced wise ideas through dialogue and through interactions with people. And she makes the case that Orunmila was doing something very much similar to that, and we should really think of Orunmila as a very similar kind of formative or foundational figure within Yoruba thought as we see within Western thought with Socrates. And so, from there we go to Oyeronka Oyewumi and her contribution within our textbook, Visualizing the Body. And she really takes a very hard line on many of the other approaches to Yoruba thought that she sees from other people. She's, very strongly thinks that there's fundamental misunderstandings that go on because Western modes of thought get transported into a Yoruba or an African context. And so those really need to be weeded out. Those really need to be pushed to the side so that you can have a clear-eyed view of what is really going on. And she identifies a number of ways in which mistakes have been made and tries to correct some of those. And she has a much longer, she's written a book and lots of other stuff on this as well. We go from there to what I'm calling a deconstructive or critical analysis. This Emmanuel Ofeaja is, talks about Ifa divination as an exercise in deconstruction. I go from there to just mention a social scientific approach. A method within African philosophy, and this is an example of that. And then finally, what I'm calling a religious or mythological analysis by Ogunyemi, and this is really doesn't present itself as a book of philosophy, but really more a book of religion, and I've given you some chapters out of it. Again, I am not asking you to read all of these things, okay? I am presenting them to you as examples of different methodological approaches, philosophical approaches to the same body of knowledge and experience, right? It's all about Yoruba thought, every one of these. And so if that's the case, I think it raises the question for us about how we go about doing philosophy, how one goes about doing philosophy in Africa, to what extent is one's, what I'm going to call positionality, or who you are, how much does that matter? And what would it look like for Africans to do African philosophy? Okay, which is ultimately, I think, an important question in all of this. So, I want to get you to think about this, and I've written some other things within the module itself to get you to think about why any of this matters, right? Because sometimes we just, if we're doing, history, we think about best practices in history. If we're doing biology, same thing. Psychology, all of these different things have a sense of best practices. In philosophy, sometimes we just think that, what philosophy does is just think really hard about, really arcane or really, technical sorts of things. The case I want to make is that philosophy's unique feature, what it brings to human knowledge, is a kind of self-reflexive ability. Okay, so in other words, it's not just the ability to look out at something, at Yoruba thought, for example, and say, okay, here's what the Yoruba believe about X, about the seasons, or about personhood, or about the future, or whatever. Here's what the Yoruba believe about this, right? We might be able to say that. I mean, there might be something we could say about those things, but would that be philosophy? There's the important question, it seems to me. Would that really be philosophy, or would that simply be kind of a history of ideas? Would it simply be, anthropology? Would it simply be, here's what people think about this in this place? I guess I'd like to argue that philosophy needs to do more than that, right? There is always a kind of judgment at stake in philosophy. We are making judgments. Our entire discipline is really about making judgments. What should we believe? What should we think, right? Not just what do people think. This is really part of what's behind the discussion in sage philosophy as well. Odera Aruka, and you're going to see this in the interview I do with Gail Presby. Odera Aruka really ultimately distinguishes between what we call folk sages and philosophical sages. And a folk sage is the sort of person who just says, here's what people in my culture believe about something. And the philosophical sage is the person who brings a critical edge to that. Not just disagreeing, but asking, well, is that right? Should we believe that? What else might we believe? What happens when two different situations within a culture suggest different kinds of beliefs, right? What if we have proverbs that say entirely different things, opposite things even? How do we come to any belief in those sorts of circumstances? I mean, that sort of thing happens all the time. And so, the philosophy deals in making judgments about things. We don't just want to describe arguments. We want to make a case for something. Here's what people ought to believe. Okay, and in a lot of other disciplines, you don't. I mean, you make that case in a certain sense by marshalling evidence. You might make a case for looking at history in a certain kind of way by marshalling evidence and saying implicitly, well, people have looked at history this way, but that's wrong. You should look at it this other way instead. But philosophers really hone down to the level of concepts, of propositions, of really at a fine-grained level, values, things of that nature. And so, in African philosophy, I think that's really important, and especially for those who are not from Africa, not from the continent, to not simply go there as if to do philosophy means to simply describe what people think about things, right? There's something more that has to happen. And so that's, you'll see more written on that in the module itself. And I hope I hope that makes some sense, right? Because really, much of this class, it's focused on African philosophy, obviously, but it's also focused on philosophy. Like, what does it mean to be a philosopher? And I think African philosophy is such a wonderful window into us thinking about that. I hope you kind of take a look at a couple of the papers that I listed under those various methods, just to get a little flavor. Again, not asking you to read them. I'm not going to test you on them, nothing like that. But what I want you to get is the sense of how different the questions are we could ask in this very same area of Yoruba thought, of Ifa thought, right? We have all of these different approaches. So it really raises the question of what it means to do philosophical research. And if we can nail that down, I think we've got something really valuable as we go forward to looking at some of the more substantive stuff we're going to be doing from here on in the course. So that's the kind of quick intro for today's stuff. Take a look at the interview with Gail Presby and take a look at what's in the module. And as always, there's a discussion area. I look forward to what you have to say in that as well. So thanks everyone, and see you over in the discussion.